a lot of this legislative session should be viewed through the lens of the November elections, and more specifically, the races for Congress on Long Island and the Hudson Valley.
Hi there, it's WAMC News Director Ian Pickus. And on this episode of the WAMC News Podcast, the New York State legislative session in the rearview mirror. Well, this year's state legislative session featured another late budget, continued debate over immigration, public safety and cannabis, and a last-minute surprise.
After careful consideration, I have come to the difficult decision that implementing the planned congestion pricing system risks too many unintended consequences for New Yorkers at this time.
Governor Kathy Hochul's decision to pause the implementation of congestion pricing dominated discussion during the harried last week of votes in Albany, and several big bills were left on the table. Joining us now to look back on the session and ahead to the campaign season is Capitol Pressroom host David Lombardo of WCNY. Welcome back, Dave.
Thanks for having me again, Ian.
So now that it's behind us, what do you think will be the major memory of this legislative session?
I think, and this may be recency bias, but it will be the unilateral action by Governor Hochul to halt congestion pricing in New York City, which was set to take effect on June 30th. And if that hadn't happened, I think this would have been remembered largely as the blah legislative session, because there weren't a lot of highlights. There weren't a lot of measures in here that got people excited. Yes, in the state budget, there was some actions designed to dramatically increase the housing supply, as well as some new protections for renters, but they didn't go nearly as far as any of the stakeholders wanted, left a lot of people unhappy. So I don't think that was going to be that memorable, especially compared to the congestion pricing action. And I think largely this will be a legislative session that'll be remembered for what didn't get done, whether it is some sort of replacement for the MTA in terms of the revenue that it's going to miss out by this congestion pricing hold, or a variety of environmental bills, criminal justice bills, and marijuana action and other health related issues that did not get done between January and June.
Now, here's a question for you, because I heard a lot of lawmakers saying, well, the governor dropped a bomb with this congestion pricing thing, and that took away a lot of attention on other things in the last week. Even Speaker Hastie said that. Is that a scapegoat, or is that really what happened with some of the major bills that didn't get over the finish line?
I think two things can be true at once, Ian, and I don't think it's limited just to the big bills that didn't get done. So to understand Albany, you need to know that we have a legislative calendar that goes from January to June. And while at the end of the session, lawmakers are regularly meeting for 4 or 5 day weeks, earlier in the year, they're meeting for 2 days, 3 days, 4 days at the most, and just for maybe an hour or two at a time. Whereas at the end of the session, they are passing a lot of bills. They're basically the students who can't work unless they have a deadline. And so that means they're saving a lot of work for the end of the legislative session. And if the governor drops a bomb in their laps like this, that means they need to spend some of that valuable time discussing it in conference. And that eats into the time that it takes to actually pass bills, because there are debates on these bills. And even if you're going to have a few minutes on every bill, that will slow things up. And you saw this play out in the number of bills that passed the Senate compared to the Assembly. The Senate has much tighter rules on debate. They were able to pass more than 700 bills in the final week of the legislative session. The Assembly was only able to pass about 400. So there are multiple things at play here, whether it's time management skills and the governor's end of session bomb, and really an unwillingness to stay too much past that scheduled end of the legislative session, all played into some issues not getting done. But then there were some issues where I questioned whether there actually was the political support in both houses to get those bills across the finish line, whether it's medical aid in dying, which is designed to allow people to end their lives with the help of a physician, or the New York Heat Act, which was designed to curtail the use of natural gas in homes. Some of these were issues that maybe the political support just wasn't there as well.
Before we leave congestion pricing, what happens now? On the issue, Governor Hochul's calling it an indefinite pause. And then you've also got the impact on the MTA budget. And if I'm reading it correctly, people left town without an answer to either.
So, with the caveat that I'm just a simple upstate bumpkin who only covers these issues from afar, it seems like we're in kind of a holding pattern on both congestion pricing and what the MTA was planning to finance with the revenue from congestion pricing, and more importantly, the bonding capacity that they would have from congestion pricing. Because a lot of this work is something that was planned for the future, though, there is an opportunity, whether it's later this year or early in 2025, for state lawmakers and Governor Hochul to identify other funding streams. And there's also just the possibility that we unpause congestion pricing maybe after Election Day, and you just miss a few months of that revenue.
There was reporting that Governor Hochul was kind of reading the political tea leaves with that decision. Are there other areas during this legislative session where you think that either the June 25th looming primary or November, when Democrats are on defense, largely factored in?
I think a lot of this legislative session should be viewed through the lens of the November elections, and more specifically, the races for Congress on Long Island and the Hudson Valley. And what you saw both with the adopted budget as well as this decision over congestion pricing is an emphasis on policies that might not get people excited to go vote in November, but for lack of better words, gave people one less thing to be pissed off about in November. When I'm saying people, I mean those moderate swing voters in the New York City suburbs who really found nothing too offensive in this budget. There was nothing that was designed to make their lives more expensive. There were no big liberal priorities like on the criminal justice or environmental front that Republicans could then run against. And here with congestion pricing, the governor, while not necessarily rallying the Democratic vote with her decision, definitely finds an issue where she's made it, maybe removed an issue for Republicans to run on in November. You can't say, well, look, she's increased your cost of living by $15 every time you want to go to New York City and don't take the train. So I think that's the lens through which to review not just the congestion pricing, but the budget and legislative session more broadly.
Perhaps one of those issues from previous years was what started out as the governor's really ambitious housing plan. What was done on the housing front in this session?
So in the budget, you essentially had the adoption of some financial incentives to develop housing and affordable housing, more specifically in New York City, as well as some upstate financial perks as well, especially when it comes to communities that adopt what have been deemed pro-growth policies. They're going to have access to some discretionary funds, essentially be at the front of the line when that money gets doled out. Additionally, in lieu of what's been deemed good cause eviction, they passed what you might call good cause light, basically imposing de facto caps on how much rent can be charged in a very narrow set of circumstances if, and this is for communities outside of New York City, those communities opt in to the good cause system. It also puts some limits on the reasons for evicting someone. Doesn't go nearly as far as the legislation that's been kicking around for 5 years, but it is, as some proponents of the compromise say, better than nothing. We'll see its actual effect based on the municipalities that adopt it, and then what the implementation and oversight is like. That really remains the big legislative accomplishment from this session, given how little got done in terms of big ticket items outside of the budget between that late April adoption of the budget and June 9th or 10th when everyone actually got out of town.
Okay, if I finish a seltzer can and I bring it back, I'm still getting a nickel. How come?
Because there were no, not just major changes, but any changes to the state's bottle redemption laws. What had been up for debate was increasing that nickel, as you mentioned, to 10 cents, as well as expanding the types of beverages that are covered. So it's not just soda, water, alcohol that's sold in grocery stores, and energy drinks and a few other things that aren't coming to mind right now, but would have expanded it to, say, iced tea and maybe your Gatorade as well, with some limitations on things that are maybe 100% juice, for example, as well as some back end changes to the system in terms of the handling fees that redemption centers get. This was really an all or nothing proposition, and nothing is what got done. It didn't pass either houses of the legislature and really didn't get a lot of steam built up, despite the cry from the redemption centers that without some sort of action, whether it was a comprehensive bill or just a change to their handling fees, they're going to go out of business. There was some movement when it comes to the environment on legislation that's known as extended producer responsibility when it comes to single-use plastic packaging. This is designed to cut down on the plastic packaging. So think of the plastic that might your favorite food items might be wrapped in, or just when you go and buy something, there might be that potentially superfluous layer of plastic. State policymakers were hoping to cut down on that. There was a compromise bill that was crafted, essentially designed to cut the waste by 30% over 12 years. It moved through the Senate. It did not come up in the assembly. So when it comes to plastic waste, that was the closest that they got to making a big change, but ultimately didn't make it through both houses.
Let's talk for a minute about criminal justice. That has dominated discussion in Albany the last few years. What happened this time?
So as you mentioned, the conversation the last couple years has been primarily about rolling back some of the changes to the state's pretrial detention laws that were adopted in 2019, essentially taking steps to make it easier to hold someone with bail prior to their trial beginning and prior to a sentence being handed down. Progressives, liberals in New York have been trying to push the pendulum the other way, trying to make it easier, say, to access parole. Nothing happened in a significant nature on that front. There was some changes to who can serve on a jury, which is seen as a win for the progressive criminal justice community. But sticking with that earlier theme I mentioned, not much got done here, kind of a blah criminal justice discussion, not even really much of a dialogue going on in this front as it pertained to criminal justice, either from the legislature or the governor in the final weeks of the session.
Okay, let's talk about Hochul's administration. She got some appointments, some key appointments in place. How are things looking for her and her team right now?
Yeah, so there were some departures in the Hochul administration earlier this year. The Parks Commissioner, the Office of Children and Family Services Commissioner, the Office for People with Developmental Disabilities, Department of Environmental Conservation, all had change-ups this year. And the governor made some appointments to some of these. Most notably, though, did not appoint a new head of the DEC. But the Senate confirmed, as they almost always do when it comes to cabinet positions, leaders for the Department of Corrections, for the Dormitory Authority, which is very important when it comes to borrowing money for big projects. The Department of State has a new leader. The Office for Temporary Disability Assistance got their leader confirmed. They've been serving in an acting capacity for about a year. And when it comes to nominations, the Senate also rubber stamped a host of appointments the governor made, both to the Court of Claims and other judicial spots around New York.
So let's talk just for a minute about where we go from here. It's fair to say Governor Hochul's polling is underwater. She's not very popular with New Yorkers. She's taking it in the neck on congestion pricing from really both sides of the aisle. Powerful Democrats in the Senate, like Liz Kruger, are criticizing her for abandoning the plan. Republicans are saying, look what we forced the governor to do. As everyone leaves Albany for the year, what's the state of play between the two democratically led houses of the legislature and the governor heading into this key election year?
I would say things are tense, but I would also say, and not to sound too nihilistic, none of it really matters. You mentioned the idea that the governor took it on the neck, both from the left and from the right. The vast majority of New Yorkers, though, either don't care about the congestion pricing issue or they're happy that she did what she did. And
Yeah,
the people
congestion
who
pricing's polling was worse than Hochul's.
Yeah, and I think at the end of the day, which is election time, that there is no repercussion for Governor Hochul or the legislature. And when I say the legislature, I mean the Democratic majorities on election day. Governor is obviously not up until 2026, but I anticipate that the Democrats are going to hold on to their very large majorities in both the state Senate and the Assembly. And the only interesting election that I see statewide is the 2026 scenario where Joe Biden wins in 2024 and Democrats face a real challenging midterm environment in 2026. And maybe an unpopular Hochul has a primary and a serious Republican challenger, or maybe a Governor Hochul has decided not to run again. That stuff is the kind of thing that a political reporter salivates about and hopes will occur. But for the most part, our statewide elections are pretty boring. The 2022 one was an exception, and that was still a Democrat holding on. So while everything that's happened in recent days about congestion pricing and all the palace intrigue is fun to cover, it's fun for insiders to talk about. I don't know whether there's that much of a hangover, either in terms of elections or what the public thinks about what's happening.
So just to wrap up, I'm looking at a sign over your shoulder for John Mannion's Senate campaign. He's running for Congress. Neil Breslin, the dean of the Senate, is retiring. You have people like Danny O'Donnell, very high-profile New York City assemblyman who's leaving. Are there any big departures that are going to take place now that the session's over before lawmakers are back in January that you think might kind of change things in Albany at all?
No, I don't think they're going to change things because despite the rhetoric and narrative that, oh, someone's got the important committee, like the Ways and Means Committee in the Assembly, where we are going to see a departure and therefore a committee shakeup. I think because the Senate Majority Leader, Andrea Stewart-Cousins, as well as the Assembly Speaker, Carl Hastie, are planning at this point to remain in place, then there will not be a major shakeup. I think that we need to think about both of these bodies in terms of their broader makeup as well as who's leading them. If you see a shift in the broader makeup of either body, whether it becomes more conservative or more liberal, I think that's more important than what happens with any one individual lawmaker, unless, of course, that lawmaker is the one leading the chamber.
Democratic primary in the 109th district prediction?
So, as someone who's not following this, I'll take the conventional wisdom, which is Dustin Reedy. And I say that because of where he's based out of
That's
geographically.
Guilderland
I don't think it has,
County Legislator, yeah.
yeah, I don't think Dustin has any major ideological edge. He doesn't clearly have a fundraising edge, and I can't speak to his get out the vote effort. But just from a geographic perspective, I'll take him in this race, and I'll also be prepared to be wrong. And maybe Gabriela Romero, a Albany City Council member, will beat him.
Dave Lombardo from the Capitol Press Room. Always a pleasure to catch up with you. Thanks for your insights. It's great to see you.
My pleasure, Pickus.
Okay, that does it for this episode of the WAMC News Podcast. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time, I'm Ian Pickus.